in the common grounds in the Mall of the Emirates. Christy Kinahan said the staff were relatively friendly, service was reasonably good. One negative point, in my opinion, was the lady serving me insisted on calling me boss. I did explain that I did not like to be called boss, and please could you call me Chris, Mr. Vincent, sir. The waitress tittered. I thought nothing more of it. We were paying the bill. My friend was kind enough to pay the bill, and we were about to leave when the same waitress made a point of saying, "Thanks, boss." Other than my sensitive disposition and taking the dining experience in its entirety, I would rate this establishment a 4 star.
In Dublin's underworld, secrets don't stay buried for long, and neither do betrayals. The morning Trevor Byrne was rushed from Mountjoy Prison to a city hospital, everything was supposed to be controlled. The timing, the escort, the route. Yet before he even reached the ward, someone on the outside already knew where he was going. Calls began flooding in, calm, deliberate voices asking the same chilling question. What room is he in? Within minutes, panic rippled through the corridors. Guards tightened formation, doctors were silenced, and Byrne's name vanished from the system like it had never existed. But behind the locked doors and flashing blue lights, one question cut deeper than all the rest. Who leaked the secret? Because in a city where gangs trade loyalty for blood, information is the most dangerous weapon of all. And that morning, someone used it to come dangerously close to turning a hospital visit into an execution. This is Kinahan Gunman Trevor Byrne, hospital risk, silent threats, and the untold story. When a man feared by many suddenly becomes the one being hunted, the story doesn't start at the hospital. It starts with the people who wanted him gone. The Kinahan-Hutch feud began as a struggle for control, money, drugs, and territory. But it soon became something darker, more personal, and blood-soaked. By the mid-2010s, Dublin streets had turned into battlegrounds where old friendships became death warrants and every corner store whispered the name of someone lost. The Kinahan Cartel, with its international reach, operated like a corporation built on silence and fear. Its enemies, including the Hutch faction, fought not just for dominance but for survival. And in the middle of this chaos, men like Trevor Byrne became both weapons and warnings, symbols of what loyalty to power really cost. Trevor Byrne wasn't born into violence, but by his late 20s, his life had already hardened into one. Garda files painted a picture of a man deeply embedded in Dublin's underworld, a man whose name sparked both fear and respect. He was linked to armed robberies, possession of illegal weapons, and suspected connections to high-ranking cartel figures. To the public, he was another dangerous criminal behind bars. But to those inside the feud, Byrne was more than a prisoner. He was an asset, a messenger, a reminder that the Kinahan network could reach into any corner of Ireland's justice system. His arrest may have ended his freedom, but it didn't end his influence. His conviction came after a dramatic operation that ended in his capture following an armed standoff. In court, Byrne showed no visible emotion as prosecutors detailed the robbery that sealed his fate. Witnesses described him as calm, almost detached, as if the sentence, over 17 years, was something he had already accepted. For some, that composure hinted at confidence. For others, it was the look of a man who believed that even prison walls couldn't truly contain him. Inside Mountjoy, he quickly became known as one of the system's highest-risk inmates, both for the danger he posed and the danger he attracted. The same network that had once protected him now made him a target. Over the years, whispers of threats followed Byrne through corridors and transfers. Guards noted anonymous warnings, cryptic notes, and coded messages smuggled in through prison mail. Gardaí intelligence units flagged him as a potential target in ongoing revenge plots tied to the Kinahan-Hutch bloodline of killings. Behind the locked doors of Mountjoy, survival wasn't guaranteed by time served. It was earned day by day, meal by meal, through silence and vigilance. Byrne lived in that tension, a man whose past was catching up faster than his sentence could contain it. When illness struck, forcing his transfer to an outside hospital, it was supposed to be routine, just another day in custody. But to those monitoring him, the timing couldn't have been worse. Information about his movement was classified, restricted to only a handful of officers. And yet, Within hours, word had already spread beyond the walls. That breach, the moment when secrecy turned into exposure, was where everything changed. It was no longer about a sick prisoner being escorted for treatment. It was about who knew, how they knew, and what they planned to do with that knowledge. That question would haunt Ireland's justice system long after Trevor Byrne was returned to his cell. It was a cold morning when the transport van left Mountjoy Prison under a discreet escort. Inside, Trevor Byrne sat chained, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him, his eyes lowered but alert. The trip was meant to be routine, handled quietly to avoid drawing attention, but even within the convoy, there was tension. An uneasy silence that guards had come to recognize as the sound of danger nearby. Byrne's health had reportedly deteriorated, forcing the transfer, but among officers, the move carried a weight that went beyond a medical emergency. For a man whose name had become synonymous with gangland danger, every movement outside the walls was a gamble, and this one, though necessary, would prove to be more dangerous than anyone had imagined. When they arrived at the Dublin hospital, Byrne was rushed into a secured room while guards took their positions along the hallway. The air inside was sterile, but the atmosphere wasn't calm, it was calculated. Each guard knew that a hospital was never just a place for healing in the criminal world. It was a weak spot, a location that couldn't be locked down completely. Within hours, whispers began circulating. Staff reported odd inquiries at the reception desk, people calling the hospital switchboard, asking quiet but pointed questions. Someone out there wanted to know exactly where Byrne was. At first, those calls seemed like ordinary curiosity, the kind that follows every high-profile inmate. But what set them apart was precision. The callers used the right names, the right language, and in some cases, the exact shift times of certain guards. It was enough to suggest that information had leaked from the inside. Mountjoy authorities were alerted when one of the calls was traced directly back to a number flagged in earlier surveillance tied to the Kinahan network. Suddenly, a medical escort had turned into a potential assassination risk. Gardaí scrambled to tighten security, sealing the hospital wing and increasing armed presence. But by then, the word had already escaped. Byrne's location wasn't a secret anymore. It was a target. Inside the ward, guards rotated frequently to avoid predictable routines, and Byrne was shifted between rooms to prevent anyone from pinpointing his exact position. But even with all the precautions, there was an unsettling awareness that someone was watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Reporters outside the hospital began speculating, citing unconfirmed security concerns, while prison officials refused to comment. Some sources claimed that intelligence hinted at a possible attack by rival associates. Others suggested the threat was internal, someone passing information for a price. Whether it was a rival gang, a rogue staff member, or simple negligence, one thing was clear. The system's walls were no longer holding. By the end of that week, confusion replaced calm. Conflicting reports flooded the media, some naming the Mater Hospital, others claiming it was another Dublin facility entirely. Anonymous insiders spoke of panic behind closed doors, while officials tried to suppress growing public curiosity. Byrne was quietly transferred back to prison once doctors deemed him stable. But the tension didn't end there. His hospital stay had exposed something larger. A network of leaks, secrets, and silent power plays hidden beneath the surface of Ireland's justice system. The question wasn't just who made those calls. It was how they knew what only a few were supposed to. And that unanswered question would linger like an echo through every investigation that followed. The investigation into the hospital incident began quietly but spread fast, touching nearly every layer of Ireland's prison and policing system. Internal memos were circulated within Mountjoy Prison, and a Garda liaison was assigned to trace the origins of the suspicious calls. What started as an inquiry into a potential data breach quickly evolved into a full-blown intelligence review. Authorities needed to know if the leak had come from within the institution or from someone who had access to operational details. Byrne's transfer logs, hospital admission times, and escort records were all pulled apart, line by line, revealing small inconsistencies that didn't sit right with investigators. The first breakthrough came when phone data linked one of the inquiry calls to a number previously associated with an associate of a known Dublin gang. It didn't confirm a plot, but it raised serious questions about how such information reached the outside so quickly. The call logs suggested that whoever made the inquiries knew more than the public ever should have known. Details only prison staff, Garda transport units, or senior coordinators could access. Garda Intelligence Bureau specialists joined the review, cross-checking communication between the hospital and the prison system. They discovered that one internal message about Byrne's transfer had been sent through a channel not meant for public access, hinting that someone had deliberately or carelessly breached protocol. Behind closed doors, officers faced an uncomfortable truth. There might have been an insider. A handful of names surfaced, including staff who had recently faced disciplinary action or had suspicious financial movements. Some denied any involvement, claiming routine communication errors, while others quietly took leave during the inquiry. The Department of Justice released no official statement, but internal chatter within the prison system spoke of a low-level leak that had been patched. Still, the tone of those messages betrayed unease. Even if one breach had been identified, there was no guarantee that another wouldn't follow, especially when criminal networks had both the money and the motivation to infiltrate systems. Media coverage during this period painted conflicting pictures. Some outlets suggested the Kinahan network had orchestrated a reconnaissance effort, testing the state's response. Others implied the incident was exaggerated to justify tightening prison security budgets. A few whistleblowers even claimed that senior officials were trying to contain embarrassment rather than expose the full truth. It became a battle of narratives, official statements emphasizing no immediate danger, while investigative journalists hinted at something more complex. A deepening overlap between Ireland's organized crime and the institutions meant to fight it. That tension between silence and exposure gave the story a haunting credibility. By the end of the inquiry, no single person was ever charged for the leak. The Gardaí labeled it a security lapse, and the report's classified sections were never made public. But the incident changed how future high-risk inmates would be handled, with new protocols for medical transfers and restricted staff communication channels. Still, among those who followed the case closely, doubt remained. Had the state truly uncovered the truth, or just buried it deeper? Because in Dublin's shadow world, secrets rarely stay hidden for long, and silence often means someone powerful is being protected. When the internal inquiry wrapped up, it led straight into a storm of legal attention. Trevor Byrne's name was already linked to some of Dublin's most volatile underworld activities, but the hospital breach added a different layer, one that questioned not just criminal accountability, but state responsibility. His defense team argued that the incident exposed the government's inability to safeguard prisoners under their control, framing it as a failure of duty rather than a gang-related mishap. In court filings and appeals, Byrne's lawyers leaned on this angle, attempting to portray him as a man targeted from every direction, by rivals, by media, and perhaps by negligence within the state's own system. For once, the courtroom wasn't debating whether Byrne had been a danger to society, but whether society had failed him in return. The hearings drew large attention. Reporters filled the corridors of Dublin's criminal courts of justice, scribbling every word of the proceedings, as Byrne's legal counsel demanded answers about the chain of command during the hospital episode. They requested records of communication between Mountjoy Prison officials and Garda authorities, but much of it remained sealed for security reasons. Byrne's appeal, however, didn't just focus on the hospital breach. It was also a challenge to his lengthy sentence for firearm-related charges. He argued that his treatment had been influenced by his reputation rather than evidence alone. Still, the judges weren't swayed. In 2025, Byrne's legal appeal was formally dismissed, with the court affirming that his rights had not been violated and that the system had acted within reasonable bounds. Outside the courthouse, reactions were divided. Some saw the dismissal as a sign that justice had finally drawn a line under a case soaked in fear and secrecy. Others saw it as another example of selective transparency, a reminder that even when the state wins, the truth doesn't always follow. Journalists who had followed Byrne's story from the beginning noted how certain topics seemed untouchable in public hearings. Mentions of the suspicious calls were quickly redirected or struck from the record, creating the impression that some truths had been managed behind the scenes. Public confidence was split down the middle. Was the judiciary protecting the system, or protecting itself from deeper exposure? Meanwhile, within the Justice Department, the case spurred quiet reform. The protocols for high-risk prisoner transfers were overhauled, new encrypted communication systems were introduced, and staff underwent additional vetting and rotation to prevent information leaks. Security officers who had been stationed during Byrne's hospital stay were reassigned to less sensitive duties. To the public, these changes were framed as routine improvements, but insiders knew they were direct responses to what had happened. It was an acknowledgement, without admission, that the system had come dangerously close to collapse under its own secrecy. For Byrne, the fallout meant tighter restrictions and fewer privileges inside prison. He was transferred under discreet conditions to another facility, far from Dublin, in an attempt to limit exposure and reduce risk. But that only added to his mystique. His name continued to echo in Gangland circles, wrapped in rumor and defiance. Even behind bars, his presence seemed to provoke questions the state couldn't easily silence. And as the courtroom lights dimmed and the reporters moved on, one truth remained. The legal victory didn't end the story. It only buried what couldn't be proven. In the shadows of that decision, the echoes of the hospital corridor still lingered, a reminder that justice can close a file long before it finds peace. Even after the case files were closed and the headlines faded, the air around Trevor Byrne's story still carried a sense of unfinished business. The official version of events never satisfied everyone. To this day, questions linger about what really happened during that hospital transfer, who leaked his location, how close a rival cell might have come, and why some of the records surrounding those calls remain redacted. Each missing detail adds another layer of mystery, a reminder that in Ireland's criminal underworld, truth is often guarded as tightly as life itself. Some believe the state buried parts of the story to protect operational secrets. Others think someone inside the system, somewhere, knew more than they ever admitted. The uncertainty didn't end with Byrne's legal defeat. It deepened. For years, the Kinahan network operated with the precision of a corporation, and Byrne's story became another warning about how deeply their influence reached. The hospital breach exposed a vulnerability not only in the prison system but in the wider architecture of state security. How could a man in custody, surrounded by armed guards, still face a credible threat from the outside? It wasn't just about Byrne anymore, it was about what his case revealed. When gang power stretches past prison walls and into institutions meant to restrain it, the line between law and lawlessness becomes dangerously thin. Beyond the paperwork and investigations, there's the human cost. The families of both victims and offenders in Ireland's Gangland War have lived years under constant fear. Mothers who avoid speaking their sons' names, children growing up without knowing why their fathers disappeared, officers who live with the anxiety of retaliation. Byrne's case reignited conversations about what it means to serve justice in an age of organized intimidation. Even those who despised his actions could not ignore what the breach implied, that no one, not even the state, is untouchable. In the quiet corners of Dublin, his story became less about guilt or innocence, and more about how far power can reach before accountability fades. Today, Byrne remains behind bars, and Ireland's justice system continues to adjust in the aftermath of the security scare. New reforms in prisoner escort protocols and data protection have been introduced, though few believe they go far enough. Whispers persist that Byrne's hospital incident was a test run, a glimpse of how rival factions might exploit future vulnerabilities. Others claim it was a warning to the state from those who operate in the shadows. We can reach anyone, anywhere. Whatever the truth, the case left a mark on the nation's psyche. It wasn't simply a story about crime. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of order in a system under pressure. So now, the final question remains. Did the state truly protect Trevor Byrne? Or did it quietly protect itself? Were those phone calls just background noise in a larger web of power, or part of something far more deliberate? What's clear is that somewhere between those hospital walls and the courtroom verdicts, a truth was lost. And maybe it's one Ireland isn't ready to face. What do you think really happened that day? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this deep dive so we can keep unraveling stories others are too afraid to tell. Because when crime and corruption overlap and justice itself becomes a mystery, that's when every voice counts.